Good day. Today, Monday 11th September, we are gradually approaching the 3.5 month point of Ukraine's offensive, and the mood in the West and in Ukraine continues to become somber, and talk of negotiations, as I've discussed in recent programs, is in the air, though the negotiations that people in the West are talking about are of a sort that the Russians are all but certain to reject outright, and which the Ukrainians, of course, are deeply unhappy about. Well, before I deal with this topic, let's just touch briefly on what is going on the battlefronts in Ukraine. And I say briefly because, again, if you look at the front lines, there isn't, in fact, much or indeed any movement at all. Now, I say that there's recently been a rather extraordinary article in the London Times which says that one shouldn't look at maps, one shouldn't ask oneself what is actually going on the maps. The fact that there's little sign of any movement on maps is not a sign of who is winning and who is losing. It is something that one has to get past. One has to take out the magnifying glass or perhaps the microscope, look close up at what is actually going on, see who is suffering the greatest attrition, and pay no attention to the maps and focus instead on that. Well, that's the London Times. The Daily Telegraph has a different article, this time a different perspective, or at least it briefly did. Yesterday, over the weekend, an article by Colonel Richard Kemp appeared in the Daily Telegraph. It only stayed visible on the website for a few hours, but you can still find it if you search, and of course its title takes a rather more pessimistic view. Ukraine's counteroffensive is stalling. The West must prepare for humiliation. Of course, Richard Kemp is one of those people who is a fervid supporter of Ukraine. He is perhaps even more a fervid supporter of defeating Russia than of achieving victory for Ukraine. His article should be understood as one of those neocon pieces that Jeff Roberts, the historian, warned about many months ago. An article which, whilst grudgingly admitting some of the realities on the battlefront, actually, when you read it through, is an article that demands further escalation from the West, a build-up in more support, military support for Ukraine in the West, in order not just to keep Ukraine fighting, but in order to achieve some kind of increasingly improbable victory at some remote future point. And Richard Kemp argues all of this, or pushes all of this, even despite the fact that, as he acknowledges, public support for the conflict in Ukraine, especially in the United States, but also now increasingly in Europe as well, is flagging. So just as the Ukrainian offensive has stalled, just as it has failed to make any breakthroughs on the battlefronts, so apparently the mood amongst Western electorates is souring, especially as the economic situation becomes more difficult for more and more people. But nonetheless, we must ignore all of that. We in the West, by which of course he means the political class in the West, must combine and increase support for Ukraine even more, must pursue essentially unconstrained, unlimited economic war against Russia, whatever the costs, on the West as well, and must ramp up military support for Ukraine to even more dangerous levels, as I said, in pursuit of this victory, which looks, as even he admits, increasingly improbable. Well, I say all of that. Let's not waste more time with these articles, either the one in the London Times or the one in the Daily Telegraph. Let's actually talk about what the situation on the battlefronts is. And I'm going to actually today go for a somewhat more general picture. One can discuss fighting that's going on in the individual villages that are the subject of this offensive, and which have been the subject of this offensive ever since the start of the offensive in June. Places like Rabotino, Kleshayevka near Bakhmut, Verbovoye, which has surfaced now a bit more, attracted a little bit more publicity. One can also talk about fighting in the Vremivka salient area, all of these places. And in fact, what one finds is that in terms of movements, it's a little bit backwards and forwards. The Ukrainians attack. They sometimes manage to advance a couple of 100 meters, one place or another. They lose all terrible losses. The Russians then counterattack once the Ukrainian advances have flagged. The Russians then regain some of the territory. Sometimes the Russians push back a bit further, and then Ukrainians reorganize. They try and pull their battered brigades together, and they go back on the attack again, and the whole process repeats itself. But the fight continues to be around these now battered, destroyed villages, Rabotino, I suspect Verbovoye before very long. Kleshayevka, I've just seen photos of what Kleshayevka now looks like. It's absolutely shattered. It is once more a village, no doubt home to people who used to live there, people with families and lives and maybe local schools and a community life. It's now been utterly obliterated over the course of this fighting. But anyway, the battles go on being fought for these small places, and about a serious advance, an advance towards the Surovikin line, towards the great fortified engineering lines that the Russians have built. Of that, so far, there is no sign. And I'm increasingly getting the sense that, as I've discussed in several programs, that Ukraine continues these attacks, continues to launch these attacks, but that overall, with every single further Ukrainian push, the energy is flagging. And one further sign that that is so is that Ukraine appears to be disregarding the advice of its Western backers. Instead of concentrating all its forces in one great armoured fist to push through from Rabotino to the Surovikin line and battle through on to Tokmak and then Militopol, all of that has clearly been abandoned now. And the result is that we're starting to see Western armoured vehicles appearing in all kinds of places where they weren't present before. So we now see, for example, Challenger 2 tanks appearing in the Vremivka salient area. There were only 14 of them to start with. It seems that at least 2 have been destroyed, so Ukraine is down to 12. But instead of these being concentrated in one place, they're being doled out in various parts of the front line, 1 or 2 at a time, where I get the sense that Ukraine is using them more as a kind of long-range artillery than in any kind of assault capacity. I understand that the rifled gun that the Challenger 2 has, it might not have the power of penetration that German and American and Russian smoothbore tank guns have, but it does have a much longer range and a greater accuracy over that range. So it's been used in a sense as a kind of long-range artillery. And that in itself is interesting because it rather supports the theory that Ukraine is running out of 155mm ammunition, that its ability to go on providing artillery support for its forces is diminishing. And so these Challenger 2 tanks are being used more like self-propelled guns than as tanks, as they were, of course, designed to be used. And we also get reports that a battered brigade of the Ukrainian army has been redeployed from the Zaporozhye front to the Avdiivka area. Avdiivka is this small town near Donetsk city. The Russians have been gradually, ever so gradually and slowly and incrementally closing in around it, tightening up the exit routes, acting, one senses, eventually to put themselves in a position where they can carry out a siege of it. Anyway, the Ukrainians have sent a battered brigade, apparently, from the Zaporozhye front to Avdiivka to try and hold the Russians back. And it's come with a number of the few remaining AMX-10RC French wheeled reconnaissance vehicles with their light 105mm guns which are not, by the way, these vehicles can't use on the move. They're not stabilized, so if the vehicles have to stop before they fire them, the armour is thin, very thin, and one gets the sense that in terms of the battlefront fields, in terms of an attempt to use these wheeled vehicles as kind of wheeled tanks, that has been an abject failure. But again, Ukraine seems to be dispersing them across the battlefronts as some kind of self-propelled artillery, perhaps in places like Avdiivka. But of course, these are low-pressure guns because that's all that the wheeled chassis can absorb, and no doubt they can do damage, but they're not as powerful as some of the artillery pieces that each side has and has used over the course of this fighting, and they're not particularly effective in that way. By the way, and briefly, Simplicius the Thinker has a long, very interesting piece on his Substack post in which he discusses artillery, a topic which I'm not obviously an expert on at all, but he takes on directly the issue, the claim, the perennial claim that Western artillery systems have longer range than Russian artillery systems. He makes the point that if one is talking gun for gun, the artillery piece that we know of with the longest range of all in the battlefields, on the battlefields, is this enormously powerful 203mm self-propelled gun that the Russians use, the Pion, as it was originally called, from the 1970s, but still extensively used by the Russian military, and that far outranges the M777 howitzers and most of the other artillery pieces that the West has supplied to Ukraine, apart from possibly the Caesar howitzers that France has supplied, and maybe some of the German self-propelled guns as well. And he also says that if we're talking about absolute ranges, the big Russian multiple rocket launch systems have the longest range of all. They can outrange even the HIMARS system. And of course, some of these big Russian, powerful Russian multiple rocket launch systems of the Tornado series, just like the HIMARS, are precision guided. So it doesn't seem as if the claims that that Western guns outrange Russian guns has much in the way of reality. I will say this, I suspect that American radar sets that have been provided to Ukraine for counter-battery use have made a difference and have helped Ukraine to some extent. It seems the Ukrainians have been more effective, perhaps under American guidance, in integrating their counter-battery radars with their artillery than the Russians up to now have been. But then again, Simplicius the thinker goes into a detailed discussion based on reports from RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, about how the Russians have been steadily improving their command and control systems and their counter-battery systems as well. And this advantage that Ukraine used to have is eroding away. I just very quickly say that one thing that I noticed that nobody talks about any longer in terms of counter-battery work is that penicillin system that the Russians introduced some months ago, which was supposed to be a revolution in counter-battery performance. Well, I presume that this system, which used audio and optical signals instead of radar ones, has actually not been the great success that it was claimed to be at the outset. And that's why the Russians talk about it. Well, they don't talk about it at all anymore. And why I noticed that it has now vanished from all discussion. Sometimes the Russians also introduce systems onto the battlefronts which have disappointing outcomes, and I suspect that the penicillin system is one. I just make the point because I notice that no one else is talking about it. Anyway, let's come to a general point about the offensive. The first thing to say is that, to all intents and purposes, the offensive has stopped. Ukraine continues to attack. It continues to launch attacks in various places. General Milley, in those comments that I spoke about yesterday, spoke about 30 to 45 days left in which Ukraine can continue to launch attacks, with the clear expectation that Ukraine will continue to launch attacks over that time. This despite the fact that none of the attacks up to now, in 3.5 months, have achieved anything, and Ukraine is still not past first base. But nonetheless, the West continues to insist that the attacks go on, and the pressure is on the Ukrainians for it to continue to go on. And that will apparently still go on until the autumn, until the rain and the autumn season begins. And I can't help but think that some Ukrainian commanders and some Ukrainian soldiers must long for that day when the rain and the mud season starts and the offensive can finally be brought to a formal stop, or at least a formal stop. But of course it won't ever be a formal stop, because the legend will be perpetuated that it can resume then in the autumn and the winter, though of course realistically it won't be. And the reason this is happening is because calling off the offensive now, calling off the offensive formally, even when the autumn rains and the mud season begins, would amount to an admission that the offensive has failed. And that is politically impossible. It is politically impossible in the West. It would result in further questions about the logic of starting this offensive in the first place. It would embolden the critics of the Ukrainian war, who also happen to be President Biden's Republican opponents in Congress, in the House of Representatives. It would make their position stronger still. It would create problems for President Zelensky in Kiev, where he is already experiencing criticism and where there is already apparently some pressure now for him to reverse his position of not allowing elections while the war is underway. There's now call for parliamentary elections, which, were they to be held, many would say his party would lose, perhaps even eventually presidential elections, which of course he clearly doesn't want to see. We will come to all that in a moment. We would also have criticism from the hardliners, from people like Budanov and others, people like Belitsky, the creator of the Azov regiment, who Zelensky had an extraordinary meeting with a short time ago. Comments, criticism from people like the extreme hardliner Dmytro Yarosh, the former head and founder of Right Sector, one of the original militant ultra-right-wing groups that participated in the Maidan events back in February 2014, which led to the fall of the constitutional and democratically elected Yanukovych government. I say that because, of course, the West at the time recognized that President Yanukovych was indeed elected constitutionally and democratically. So Zelensky doesn't want to admit formally that the offensive has failed. The Biden administration doesn't want to admit formally that the offensive has failed. In Germany, the Scholz government doesn't want to admit this either. Chancellor Scholz, of course, put his position at some risk. He was going to some extent against the trend with German opinion by agreeing back in the winter to supply Ukraine with Leopard 2 tanks. He had to push out his defense minister and replace his defense minister in order to get that done. He also had to provide detailed explanations to the German people as to why he was prepared to do that. It was not an entirely uncontroversial decision in Germany. And of course, as various retired generals in Germany, people like General Kuyat, have been saying, they weren't happy with that decision either. They were concerned that the German army, the German military, isn't in a good state, and they were asking why, given that that was so, Germany was transferring its limited stock of Leopard 2s to Ukraine. And of course, in Britain, the same concerns, the same questions would be asked about the Sunak government, its decision to press ahead and supply Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine. Again, not an entirely popular decision within the British military, which now has only 40 operational tanks left, apparently. And of course, President Macron in France, facing even greater political pressure in France. He is not happy, he would not be happy with the thought that the Ukrainian offensive has been agreed to have failed. After all, it was he who took the first step of breaking the taboo, supposed taboo, about supplying Ukraine with heavy armour when he took the decision to supply those frankly useless, sorry to put it that way, AMX-10 RCs to Ukraine. So all the Western leaders, all Western governments, but perhaps most especially those of the United States and Germany, would feel themselves under extreme pressure, would face intense embarrassment if it were to be formally acknowledged that the Ukrainian offensive has been a failure. So one can't admit that. One must go on with the pretense that the offensive is still continuing, that it still has some prospect of success. They're all waiting until the autumn rains close in, until the mud season starts, so that they can then say that the weather has imposed a pause, but they will then all turn around and say that this pause is not actually the end of the offensive. They will pretend that the offensive can resume in the late autumn and winter and perhaps even the spring. And then, of course, they will hope that people will then move on and start talking about other things and forget about this offensive that ended in such failure. Now, I have to say that that's a perhaps rather cynical take about Western and indeed Ukrainian approach to the offensive. And of course, it's not just a cynical take, it is also a bitter one, because I've been, again, tracking a lot of the reports about what's going on the front lines, the actual fighting that is taking place. And though I've made it clear that I do not fully agree with Mr. Richard Stephen Hack's methodology, he puts Ukrainian losses much higher than I would do. He assumes that the Russian Defense Ministry reports give losses of Ukrainian soldiers killed, whereas I think that they are killed and wounded, and that immediately makes for differences in the way that we calculate Ukrainian losses. Well, I don't calculate Ukrainian losses, he does, or tries to, but I think he's putting them much too high. But anyway, what I will say is he is right, undoubtedly, that Ukrainian losses have been horrendous. This has been admitted, not just in Ukraine, but increasingly in the media in the West. We've had those two programs on the BBC, very upsetting and distressing programs. And I'm going to go further. I'm going to say this. I think that over the last few weeks, since perhaps the start of September, perhaps consequent upon Ukraine trying to continue its attacks with light infantry assaults, unsupported by heavy artillery, because Ukraine is now short of artillery, unsupported with armour, because armour is now in short supply. And by the way, going back to that astoundingly good programme on the new Atlas with Scott of Calibrated made the point that we focus too much on losses by Ukraine of its Western equipment, its Leopard 2s, its Bradleys, its Strikers, its Challengers, all of those things, though we're starting to see more and more and more of those being destroyed as well. But it is the loss by Ukraine of its Soviet-era equipment, both what it had before, also what it was supplied from Eastern Europe, which is in some ways even more of a problem, because not only was this equipment the equipment that Ukraine understood better and which was better adapted to its needs, but I would also argue that it is better adapted to the specifics of the Ukrainian landscape. The open steppe that we see so much of this offensive being fought over, those kind of places, very different from the dense urban areas of Central Europe, where, of course, a lot of these Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles were designed to fight. But anyway, Ukraine pressing on with light infantry assaults, without enough artillery support behind them, without enough armoured vehicles to carry the troops. My own sense is that we've moved now from a situation, especially maybe in the last week of August, or perhaps since the start of September, where it's no longer a case of a proper battle being fought. It's becoming more like the killing fields. Ukrainian soldiers being sent in significant numbers, but in small groups at a time, and killed by Russian artillery, by Russian machine guns, by Russian mortars, by Russian troops in fortified positions. And this is a horrifying reality, but I think it is the correct one. It is the one that best captures now what is really going on as this offensive finally runs down. Because the politics of it in Kiev, in the European capitals, in the United States, means that it cannot be called off. It is being continued in this way. And that might explain also, by the way, why we're seeing increasing numbers of Ukrainian soldiers simply giving up. There's been lots of reports that are difficult to evaluate because, of course, the scale upon which this is happening is difficult to measure. Neither side provides huge amounts of details about this. But my sense is that large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers, when they are sent onto the battlefield, increasingly a lot of them are looking to desert by essentially handing themselves over to the Russians. And there was a curious report, I think yesterday, where 11 Ukrainian soldiers apparently surrendered to 4 Russian paratroopers, which suggests to me that they weren't intent on fighting very much. And there's apparently been a statement from a Ukrainian official, I haven't seen it, but others have reported it, that this person is apparently saying that it's becoming more difficult for Ukraine to bargain with the Russians for release of prisoners, because the Russians now hold so many more prisoners than Ukraine does. And of course, if we're looking at increasing numbers of desertions, and there's multiple Russian reports that say that, well, that gives us a sense of what is going on. In the meantime, of course, the Russians bide their time. We hear every day about Russian forces improving their positions around Kupiansk. It seems that fighting in Sinkovka and Petropavlovka, these 2 villages near Kupiansk, is now well underway. But the Russians are in no hurry to launch a general assault. And if the situation on the battlefronts is, as I say, if it is a case of killing fields rather than proper battles, well, it would explain it. It would explain why the Russians continue to operate attrition in the way that they do. Because their objective, clearly, is when they launch their own offensive with all the huge forces that they're gathering, to do so against the Ukrainian military that is as weakened as possible. So that is my overall assessment of the state of the actual fighting at the moment. I'm not gone into the detail that I sometimes do. I don't think there's very much point any longer in going into the weeds, talking about the advance here or the retreat there, because ultimately it's just movements constantly now around the same places. Rabotino, Klashayevka, Verbovoye, Kurdyumovka, Orozhainove, Staromayorsk. There's another village, by the way, called Staromayorskie, which is not the same place, apparently. But anyway, we get all Pyatikhatki, we get all of these movements of men, but in the end, the situation remains the same, or, as the Russians like to say, the same as always. Anyway, I've discussed also in various programs about how there's now also a growing realization in the West that Ukrainian victory is unachievable, and also a gradual contemplation of the reality that some kind of negotiating process with the Russians needs to happen, because this war is becoming an embarrassment and it's proving increasingly difficult to sustain support for Ukraine at anything like previous levels. And if you want to get a sense of that, consider this. I haven't heard of any further British deliveries of weapons to Ukraine for many, many weeks now. The British, who were these enthusiastic supporters of Ukraine throughout 2022, Boris Johnson and Ben Wallace, they gave Ukraine vast numbers of anti-tank missiles at the beginning, and then they gave Ukraine all kinds of armoured vehicles, and of course ultimately those Challenger 2 tanks and the Storm Shadows, and self-propelled guns. Well, they've run out of everything they have, or so it seems, and they're not giving as much as they did before. And US military support also seems to be dying down. I read a piece, I think it was on Slavyangrad, might have been somewhere else. Of course, this is a Russian or pro-Russian source, but again, I think a reliable and accurate one. It points out that perhaps the United States has a stockpile of around 700 ATACMS missiles, which is, by the way, the same number as Britain had, as I understand it, of Storm Shadows. The United States cannot realistically supply its entire stockpile of ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, even were it to decide to supply those missiles. So it can only supply a relatively limited number, and not enough to make any significant difference. It has to keep back some of these ATACMS missiles, because though the replacement for the ATACMS is now apparently in initial production, it will take a while for it to be produced in quantity, and the United States needs its ATACMS missiles to face off against China in the Pacific. So we're not talking about large numbers of these missiles that can be supplied to Ukraine. And as Brian Belletic correctly pointed out, it is some time now since the United States announced deliveries of Patriot anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine. This despite the fact that the Russians continue to launch drone strikes on Kiev, as they did just the other day. So, a general rundown of Western support. Belgium has said that it's not supplying F-16s to Ukraine. It says its F-16s are too old, too run down. They can't be supplied in any great quantity. And in fact, it wouldn't make any sense to supply them at all. And this has produced some rather sharp rejoinders from some commentators pointing out that Belgium Belgium's F-16 stock of F-16s is actually less old than that of the Netherlands, which is supplying its F-16s, and the F-16s that the Netherlands had were used more intensively than Belgium's were. So this looks a bit like an excuse, but anyway, it looks as if Belgium has quietly pulled out of the fighter coalition. And there are now also reports that the United States is again slow walking its delivery of M1 Abrams tanks. We heard earlier in the year that the United States was going to accelerate the delivery of these tanks. It was going to go for a rather less modern variant in order to get more of these tanks onto the Ukrainian battle lines faster. They would be tanks, however, with less advanced armour, which, by the way, I'm told, means that they are actually more vulnerable to Russian artillery and missile attacks than the Leopard 2s and the Challenger 2s, which have been knocked out by the Russians and of which we've seen these pictures of them burning on the steppes. Anyway, the United States has apparently decided that earlier claims that they would be provided to Ukraine sometime this month, this isn't going to work. They have to be supplied later. It's been insinuated that the Ukrainian operators of the Abrams tanks need more time to train on them. Already it's been suggested that the reason that this delivery is being delayed, apparently to the late autumn, is so that they can arrive in Ukraine after the end of the offensive, because the United States doesn't want pictures of the Abrams tanks burning on the steppes as part of the offensive, in the same way that there's been pictures of the Leopard 2s and the Challenger 2s burning on the steppes. Again, that might invite criticism, and it could conceivably harden the position in the United States of the Republican opponents of the war, who are becoming increasingly ascendant within the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. And it seems that the United States, for the same reason, is now slow walking delivery of the F-16s, or I should say not so much delivery of the F-16s, as training of the F-16 pilots. They were supposed to come in the summer. Ukraine wants them supplied sooner than that. The United States is unwilling to do that. Again, it doesn't want pictures of F-16s being shot down, or perhaps the debris of F-16s on the ground picked over by Russian search teams. Anyway, that's all going on. So, in the meantime, as I said, more talk of negotiations. And on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I did a program recently about Secretary of State Blinken's visit to Kiev, in which we said that it seemed to us that Blinken came to Kiev with a very hard message for Ukraine, basically telling the Ukrainians that some kind of discussion process with the Russians now needed to get underway, and that ultimately Western support, US support for Ukraine was tailing off, and that some kind of compromise, though as we've discussed also not really a compromise, but some kind of discussion to freeze the conflict now needed to be put in place. That was why he went there, stayed overnight as he's never done before. That's probably why Defense Minister Reznikov got, one of the reasons he got sacked, because he's opposed to freezing the conflict. That's the message that Secretary Blinken, we've thought on the Duran, That was the message he came with to Kiev. And we said it would not be welcome with the Ukrainians, but that seemed to us, that's what we thought on the Duran, what was going on. And I've been saying the same thing over the course of the various programs that I've been making on this channel. And what we now have is a fascinating interview given by President Zelensky to The Economist. And of course, The Economist, hardline, neocon-oriented magazine par excellence, fervently supportive of the Ukraine, place which Zelensky could give an interview to and be confident of a sympathetic response. But look at what the interview says, and note all of this interview appears just a few days after Secretary of State Blinken is in Kiev. Now, I don't absolutely know that this interview was given following Blinken's visit, though I think it likely. We're not given the date of the interview. It could have been earlier. Apparently it took place on the margins of something called the Yes Conference, which has been going on in Kiev. But anyway, this is what, I don't know when that conference took place, but I'm assuming it was after Blinken's visit. People can find out and perhaps confirm on the threads. But anyway, my own point is, look at what Zelensky is saying. And we read first paragraph. Vladimir Zelensky does not want to think about a long war, let alone talk about the possibility to Ukrainians, many of whom still dream of winning fast. But that is precisely what he is preparing for. I have to be ready, my team has to be ready for the long war, and emotionally I am ready. And we're told that this interview took place at the margins of the Yes Conference, an international powwow in Kiev, and that Zelensky, over the course of this interview, was calm, composed, and sombre. And The Economist goes on to say, at the same setting a year ago, the mood was electric and euphoric. News of Ukraine's forces' success in pushing Russia back from the Kharkiv region was pinging on every smartphone in the room. This year, the atmosphere is very different. 3 months ago, into its counter-offensive, Ukraine has made only modest progress along the all-important southern axis in the Zaporozhye region, where it is trying to sever Vladimir Putin's land bridge from Russia to Crimea. The question of how long that will take or whether it will succeed weighs on the minds of Western leaders. And then the interesting points. They still talk the good talk, pledging that they will stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. But Mr. Zelensky, a former television actor with an acute sense of his audience, has detected a change of mood among some of his partners. I have this intuition, reading, hearing and seeing their eyes when they say, "We'll always be with you." But I see that he or she is not here, not with us. Now, who might he be talking about? Could it be if this interview took place after Secretary Blinken's visit to Kiev, that this is a not so subtle reference to Secretary Blinken and perhaps to the Danish Prime Minister who was also there? As I said, I'm not absolutely sure when this interview took place, but if it did take place following that visit, well, you can draw your own conclusions. And anyway, he talks, the rest of the interview goes into great detail about how Western support is flagging, about how the Russians are seeking to draw Ukraine into a war of attrition. Zelensky says, in my opinion, somewhat absurdly, that if Donald Trump wins the election in the United States next year, he will continue to support Ukraine. I see absolutely no reason to think that. Why he believes that, again, I'm not really sure. Maybe he's preparing himself for the possibility that Ukraine might find itself having to deal with President Trump next year. I'm not going to devote any more time to that. He also talks about how Russia will break. Again, no sign of this. He admits that President Putin in Russia has 60 to 70% support. He says that the Russian economy will crack. Again, I don't understand why he thinks that. There's been, by the way, more economic news from Russia. The finance ministry is now saying in Russia that oil and gas revenues have now fully recovered, and that tax revenues from the non-energy sector of the economy is surging, and that the budget is now in surplus, and that the overall deficit will indeed be around 2% this year as originally planned, and that economic growth will be well over 2%. The central bank, by the way, is saying 2.2%. Others put it higher at 2.5%. We'll just have to see. But anyway, overall, there is growing mood of optimism in Russia about the state of the economy, though there is some concern that inflation has upticked, and there's some talk of a further increase in interest rates. But overall, as I said, the mood tends to be optimistic. And nonetheless, Zelensky still holds out for the hope that Russia will crack. He talks about the Prigozhin affair. He resurrects the Prigozhin affair. And he talks about him, about all of that. But he still wants to rule out compromise with Putin. And this is what this is all about. So he says that, tapping loudly on the table, Mr. Zelensky rejects outright the idea of compromise with Vladimir Putin. War will continue for as long as Russia remains on Ukrainian territory. A negotiated deal would not be permanent. The Russian president has a habit of creating frozen conflicts on Russia's borders, in Georgia, for example, not as ends in themselves, but because his goal is to restore the Soviet Union. Those who choose to talk to the man in the Kremlin, and it's interesting that he says that there are some people, by implication, who do want to talk to the man in the Kremlin, are tricking themselves, much like Western leaders who signed an agreement with Adolf Hitler at Munich in 1938, only to watch him invade Czechoslovakia. The mistake is not diplomacy, the mistake is diplomacy with Putin. He negotiates only with himself. The last are Zelensky's words. Curtailing aid to Ukraine will only prolong the war. This is Zelensky again, and it would create risks for the West in its own backyard. There is no way of predicting how the millions of Ukrainian refugees in Europe would react to their country being abandoned. Ukrainians have generally behaved well and are very grateful to those who sheltered them, but they will not forget that. They will not forget that generosity. But it would not be a good story for Europe if it were to drive these people into a corner. Now, I have to say, that is a really ugly threat. It suggests that Ukrainian refugees, some of them, might turn out to be some kind of Trojan horse in Europe if the West gives up on Ukraine. I'm not going to discuss that further, but that is what Zelensky is talking about. He's essentially threatening the Europeans with the Ukrainians in their midst if they don't go on supporting Ukraine. But then he goes on to say a long war of attrition would mean a fork in the road for Ukraine. The country would lose even more people, both on the front lines and to emigration. It would require a totally militarized economy. The government would have to put that prospect to its citizens, Mr. Zelensky says, without specifying how. A new social contract could not be the decision of one person. Almost 19 months into the war, the president says he's morally ready for the switch, but he will only broach the idea with his people if the weakness in the eyes of his Western backers becomes a trend. Has the moment come? No, not yet, he says, thank God. So he's so far from being prepared to talk about negotiations. He rejects negotiations outright. He says if the West cuts Ukraine off, then Ukraine will militarize its economy, militarize its entire society, and go for total mobilization. And of course, in the meantime, Western countries, European countries especially, with all these Ukrainian refugees, well, they better watch out. Very bleak picture, a very somber picture, a very menacing picture. We see Zelensky threatening the West, but it's difficult to avoid, when reading this interview, to come away with any other impression than the one which I've discussed many times in these programs, and which we also discussed on the Duran, that Zelensky is now being told that there have to be negotiations with the Russians because Western support for Ukraine is essentially running out. Ukraine has failed to win in this offensive. Perhaps Western leaders, perhaps the United States, perhaps the administration still can't quite bring themselves to believe that if the Western tap is turned off or at least dialed down, Ukraine could be overrun quickly. We'll come to that shortly. But anyway, Zelensky is told that there have to be negotiations. He is so committed to the war, he's invested so much of his political capital in it, that he can't face that prospect. He is doing what President Thieu did in South Vietnam and President Ghani did in Afghanistan, faced with the prospect that his backers are bailing out on him. He is doubling, tripling, quadrupling down. He's talking about general mobilization, about bringing everybody in Ukraine into line to fight the Russians by themselves. He admits in the interview that Ukrainian morale is starting to flag. He's worried about morale in Ukraine, but he's not prepared to talk because he understands that his political survival, perhaps even his physical survival, now depend on him continuing the war. So, extraordinarily bleak. But let's put aside Zelensky's problems and go back to the topic of negotiations. And we've now had a very interesting interview that Secretary Blinken has given on the topic of negotiations with ABC. Now, I'm going to read the relevant passage in full. Now, this is the question which I think, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, I think was partly planted, but this is what the question that Secretary Blinken responded to says. Let me move on to your time in Ukraine. You spent quite a bit of time with President Zelensky. What is your sense? How does he see this ending? Does he see himself coming to a negotiating table with the Russians at some point? How does this end? And then Blinken replies as follows. Well, first, I found both President Zelensky and every Ukrainian that I met, whether it was folks in the government or it was many other Ukrainians that we had a chance to engage with over the course of 2 days, incredibly resilient, incredibly courageous, incredibly resolute. And ultimately, that's really what's at the heart of this, and the reason that I remain very confident in Ukraine's ultimate success, which is that they're fighting for their country, for their future, for their freedom. The Russians are not. So that's the usual cliches which all American diplomats, unfortunately, nowadays, it seems, must hide behind, and certainly Blinken always does. But then we come to the more interesting points, and he says, keep in mind, Putin has already lost in what he was trying to achieve. He was trying to erase Ukraine from the map, end its independence, subsume it into Russia. Now, again, that's what Blinken says, but of course it's not true. If you go back to Russian statements at the start of the war, if you go to Putin's statements at the start of the war, he made it very clear that he was looking to protect Donbass. He set out his various conditions, which were independence for Donbass, protection for Crimea, demilitarization in Ukraine, denuclearization in Ukraine, the eradication in Ukraine of its far-right ideology, and Ukrainian neutrality. It was not about conquering Ukraine. Putin specifically denied that that was his agenda in a meeting that he had on the very day that the special military operation was launched, when he spoke with President Aliyev. He also denied it a few days later when he met up with Russian airline workers. And of course, throughout February, March, into April, he tried to negotiate with the Ukrainians on all of these points that he'd set out. And we had the Istanbul Accords. But of course, Secretary Blinken won't acknowledge any of that. He says it was all about Russia trying to conquer Ukraine. But we have to pretend, if we freeze the conflict, that somehow Putin has failed to achieve his original objective. So already we can see how a future potential narrative, if negotiations get underway, is now being shaped. And then this is where Blinken goes on. Now, where exactly this settles, where lines are drawn, that is going to be up to Ukrainians. But I found a strong determination to continue to work to get their territory back that's been seized by Russia. And as to negotiations, John, it takes two to tango. And thus far, we see no indication that Vladimir Putin has any interest in meaningful diplomacy. If he does, I think the Ukrainians will be the first to engage and will be right behind them. Everyone wants this war to end, but it has to end on just terms and on durable terms that reflect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, that's completely different from what Zelensky has just said. Zelensky says you can't negotiate with Putin at all. Negotiating with Putin is tantamount to negotiating with Hitler. Negotiating with Putin would be 1938 all over again. But that's not what Blinken is saying. Blinken is saying, yes, there have to be negotiations. The Russians have to show that they're willing to engage Ukraine in what Blinken calls meaningful negotiations. It doesn't specify what that means, but if the Russians are prepared to do that, then the Ukrainians will be the first to engage and will be right behind them. And of course, that's quite different from what Zelensky is saying. Blinken is open to negotiations. In fact, when we get the sense from this that he rather wants to see them happen. Zelensky, of course, is still ruling them out. Now, of course, Blinken does talk about to end on just terms and on durable terms that reflect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, again, I don't want to overrate Blinken's verbal abilities, but again, I do think that this was a planted question, and I do think that this is a prepared answer. So consider again those words very carefully. These are in Blinken's interview. To end on just terms and on durable terms that reflect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Blinken is not saying that the territories that Russia controls must be returned to Ukraine. He is saying that the terms must be durable and just, but they must reflect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The word reflect gives the game away, because whereas Zelensky is talking about Ukraine, the only basis upon which Ukraine can proceed is that it regains control of all of its territory. That's not what Blinken says. Blinken is leaving it open for there to be an agreement which leaves the Russians in control of what they have, but of course that must be done in a way that doesn't undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In other words, Ukraine doesn't need to recognize that, nor of course to the Western powers. We have, in other words, a frozen conflict in which the Russians remain in occupation of what they have. Ukraine doesn't recognize it. The West doesn't recognize it. The West, however, is free to go on providing military support to Ukraine and to extend to it its security guarantees. So there's the difference. It's set out fairly clearly if you look at what Blinken is saying and what Zelensky is saying. Blinken's comments made directly after his trip to Kiev. Zelensky's comments to The Economist, almost certainly, at least in my opinion, almost certainly also made following Blinken's visit to Kiev. Blinken going to Kiev, talking about the need for a freezing of the conflict, but that's the only real way forward now. Zelensky pushing it back, rejecting it outright, making threats. This comment about what Ukrainian refugees in Europe might do is a really ugly threat, bearing in mind some of the things that Ukraine has been doing in Europe, in Russia, the assassination program, for example that we saw even The Economist now admit is taking place. And of course, Zelensky also talking about a war economy and total mobilization. Fantasies, needless to say, that he is retreating into. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear, yet again, that freezing the conflict, the kind of negotiation that Blinken is talking about, that he's pushing the Ukrainians towards, it's not going to happen. The Ukrainians don't want it, nor, of course, and primarily do the Russians. And we've had more comments from people like Medvedev, essentially ruling it out. I believe Peskov has said much the same recently, that there's no possibility of Russia agreeing to freeze the conflict in the way that the Americans would like. So the war is going to continue, it's going to grind on. Probably the Russians will be going on the offensive themselves fairly soon, maybe as soon as the autumn mud season is out of the way, who knows. Perhaps in Washington, going back to Larry Johnson's piece on Sonar 21, they haven't worked out that a Russian offensive would have a devastating effect. But anyway, one way or the other, the offensive has to carry on because we can't admit that it's failed. We hold out till the autumn rains and then hope that people will forget about the offensive. We'd like the Ukrainians and the Russians to get together and agree to freeze the conflict. But we in the West, if that doesn't happen, will still gradually dial down our support for Ukraine. We're no longer looking for an outright victory. And in the meantime, if the Russians launch their offensive, well, we saw Russian offensives in 2022, as we think, failed. We saw the Russian winter offensive of last year. It failed to happen, even though, of course, as I've discussed, actually it did. And it happened in a place called Bakhmut, and it ended in a Ukrainian defeat. But we discount the real risk of a Russian offensive because, well, we don't really believe in it. And we assume that things could tick on until the election and hope for the best. That, it seems to me, is where we now are in this war. It is a dismal, a catastrophic outcome. Catastrophic, first and foremost, for Ukraine. Ultimately, I think, bad for the West as well. If you want a detailed discussion about the obstacles of negotiations, then please go to our program on the Duran with Professor Mearsheimer. See what he has to say about this. See about the impossible difficulty of getting the United States to negotiate a proper solution to the outcome of Ukraine, to accept that Ukraine cannot join NATO and to agree to that to the Russians, with the Russians, in a formal document. Something that guarantees that the war will go on with, well, in my opinion, the outcome, the disastrous outcome for the West and, of course, for Ukraine itself, that I have outlined in many programs, quite conceivably leading to the destruction of Ukraine as we have known it. Anyway, that's where we are. An offensive that's degenerated into killing fields. Obviously a difficult meeting between Blinken and Zelensky. The Americans looking to freeze the conflict. the Ukrainians pushing back, no meaningful negotiations, no truly meaningful negotiations. Blinken has, again, changed the meaning of the word meaningful when he talks about negotiations. What he calls meaningful negotiations are negotiations that the Russians will never agree to. What he calls, what the Russians would call meaningful negotiations, he will never agree to. So a war, a conflict that is at an impasse, a diplomatic impasse, even while the situation in Ukraine heads towards, well, I very much fear, or perhaps expect, and I know many will hope, some kind of outcome of collapse. Well, the world, as I've said already, is not just Ukraine. As I've been making this program, there's been reports that Kim Jong-un's armoured train is trundling northward, presumably towards Vladivostok, where Putin is apparently also heading for a conference, the Far Eastern Conference that takes place, that the Russians regularly engage, the Eastern Economic Forum. We'll see what happens there. The South Korean and Russian foreign ministers, Lavrov and, well, I can't remember the South Korean foreign minister's name, but apparently the South Koreans asked for this meeting. It took place in Delhi at the G20 conference. The South Koreans anxiously asking Lavrov, no doubt, about what is going on between Russia and North Korea. We don't have a huge amount about this meeting, but there's been a report from TASS, and it reads as follows. The foreign ministers of the Republic of Korea and Russia, Park Jin, that's his name, and Sergei Lavrov have discussed topical issues of bilateral relations and the situation on the Korean peninsula, the South Korean Foreign Ministry has said. And it's clear that it was the South Koreans who sought the meeting. The meeting was held on September 10th on the sidelines of the G20 summit in New Delhi. Park Jin held consultations with the Russian side on the security problems of South Korean citizens living in Russia and discussed ways of resolving the difficulties of South Korean companies in Russia. He also said that relations between Russia and North Korea, which concerned the Korean Peninsula's issues, should be in line with UN Security Council resolutions and develop in a way that promotes peace and stability in the region. Park also stated that the need for establishing peace in Ukraine as soon as possible, and asked Russia for constructive cooperation with the UN Security Council on Korean Peninsula issues. Now, I said that one of the purposes of the meeting between the Russians and the North Koreans, between Putin and Kim Jong-un, might be to gain leverage, for the Russians to gain leverage over South Korea. And we see that. I'm going to unpack this South Korean readout. I'm going to suggest that when Park Jin talks about the security problems of South Korean citizens living in Russia and discuss ways of resolving the difficulties of South Korean companies in Russia, what he's actually talking about is South Korea edging back from some of the sanctions, the US-inspired sanctions. He's telling the Russians, look, we don't like the fact that your president is going to meet Kim Jong-un. We don't like all this talk about military cooperation between you and the North Koreans. Economic cooperation, with that we don't want to talk about, but remember, North Korea is also under UN sanctions in respect of all of that. If you don't press on with all of this, we will pull back a bit on the sanctions. That's how I read this. That's what the South Koreans, rather anxiously and worriedly, are telling the Russians. The Russians, of course, if I'm right in this interpretation, will say to the South Koreans, well, you know, our relations with North Korea are for us to resolve and talk about. We're not going to break any UN sanctions. That's not what we do. But we will nonetheless develop our relationship with North Korea to the extent that we can. And, of course, seeing that the South Koreans are being made nervous by this, that incentivizes the Russians to continue their outreach to North Korea at this time. It's a complicated game that the Russians and the two Koreas are playing, and we will see how it shapes out. But we can already see how already these Russian moves towards North Korea are, or so it seems to me, starting to play out to Russia's advantage. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm not going to say more. We will see what happens when Kim Jong-un does arrive, presumably in Vladivostok or wherever it is in Russia that he's going, and what comes out of this meeting between Putin and Kim Jong-un. But as I said, if one of the intentions of the Russians was to gain leverage over the South Koreans, as I said in previous programs, given that South Korea has been supplying artillery shells to the United States, and of course some of those almost certainly have been ending up in Ukraine, well, it's already achieved its effect. And of course, when Park Jin talks about the need for establishing peace in Ukraine as soon as possible, we can perhaps see that the South Koreans are telling the Russians, well, perhaps giving all those shells to the Americans might not have been a good idea after all, because what we actually want to see in Ukraine is peace. But of course, that's for you and the Ukrainians to sort out. We aren't really involved. Anyway, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Complex program, detailed things to talk about. But clearly we are at a pivot in the war, and we'll see where it goes from here. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you once more that you can find all of our programs on our various platforms, Locals and Rumble, and before long, X. And also, please remember you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buy yourself the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day, and speak again soon.